Let me just introduce Kate Bravery, who is a partner and global practice leader at Mercer. Mercer Consulting Group is a leading firm specializing in leadership and organizational change. And she's specifically in charge of this project, which she's going to present, which is called The Future of Work. Renee and myself thought that it would be useful for us for this audience to learn about global trends that are happening post-pandemic, and so Kate is going to illustrate that. Thank you so much, Kate.
Great, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Wonderful. All right, well, first off, I'm really glad to be invited here. It's absolutely a privilege to spend some time on the Jubilee weekend, hopefully with like-minded peers. Global talent trends and future work is my job and my passion, and so I'm really looking forward to exploring it today. Paula has said to me that you like data, so I took that as read, and I have about 20 heavy data slides, but I'll send you those afterwards, and plus anything else that you're interested in coming out of our questions and discussions. I've had the privilege of running Mercer's Global Talent Trends for the last 7 years since we started doing this research, and it's really started to gather in momentum. And one thing's really clear about the data this year is that a lot of the trends that previously were associated with the future of work, AI and automation, skills, digitization, permanent flexibility, D&I, have absolutely accelerated. And it's so interesting because it's not those individual trends that are the challenge, it's the intersection of them. And what does that mean for businesses, for societies and individuals? And I think the more we can share information and ideas to crack the nut on some of the topics that we are challenged with, the better we will all be for that. So I'm looking forward to sharing that. I often get asked, what are some of the big questions around the world? Mercer is getting asked by their clients, and there's probably two big ones at the moment. One is, which of these trends really are a product of the pandemic era, and which of those are set to stay and are genuinely influencing the future of work? And the second question is, as we continue to charter uncertain times where we might be facing high inflation, a recession, and a hot labor market, which frankly none of us have experienced before, where should we be putting our investment really to get the best return for our businesses, our economies, and societies? We probably answer those questions in different ways to the way you do, but I think we're all here to discuss those same topics today. Since we just all had a fantastic lunch, and as I mentioned, it is the Jubilee here in the UK, I thought I'd wake you all up with a short video. So the rise of relatable organisation is the central thesis coming out of this year's study. There are a few things that really stood out loud from the data, and one was those organisations that are coming off mute, being very transparent about the future of work, and working with their people to design the future seem to be faring across a lot of the metrics that we look at. So let me tell you a little bit about the data. Because the topic today is on the future of work, I'm going to cling to the Global Talent Trends study because we've just released it. It's an amalgamation of nearly 11,000 voices from around the world. And I heard that you're interested by looking at differences across geographies and industries. It has a valid data set across 16 geographies and 13 industries. What do I mean by that? It's based on 3 populations: C-suite executives in all of those countries, senior HR professionals, typically top of the house or one level down, and the biggest group is the employee voice, which we felt was really important, just given some of the changes that we've seen. It is opinion data, but we do quite a lot with it. We do some regressions. We do have a look at cuts across the data between people who feel that they're thriving, less thriving. And because we've been doing it for a while, we have year-over-year data, which is really interesting. You saw some of the big headlines in that video. 81% feel at risk of burnout this year. 96% expect companies to make progress on their sustainability agenda. We have never seen figures like that. So a really big shift in expectations and attitudes. I won't go into the details here around these demographic sets, but one thing that I found really heartening from the C-suite one is they really do recognize that the business and the people agenda are never been more entwined. So the amount of time they're spending with HR, their chief sustainability officer, their chief D&I has gone up considerably. But they do believe that we need a fundamental reset of how we think about working in the workforce if we move ahead. The other thing I found quite interesting, before the pandemic, it's a stat I didn't quote, but in our 2020 study, we asked executives, how much percentage of your workforce do you think could adapt to the future of work? And they averaged on 45%, which is staggeringly low. We've proven we can adapt, which is great. And if you look down at the employee voice, everybody feels a lot more empowered. But we aren't there yet, because despite all that empowerment, people still feel that work is exhausting, energy levels are more depleted than we've ever seen them before, and a staggering number feel at risk of burnout. Implications for HR, well, they're spending a lot more time. We asked HR, of the changes you've seen during these 2 years, which one's set to stay? The top one was working with the executive team on people risks. A lot more activity around scenario planning and risk mitigation, which I think is really exciting. And the majority of them are changing their HR model, moving away from the old world of functional silos or the Ulrich model to a focus on personas and target interactions with different populations. So lots going on that is really exciting. Let me share with you some of the headlines. In terms of macro trends, I don't think you'll be surprised on that. Cybersecurity was number 1. Accelerated digitization was number 2, and number 3 was inflation. That order probably has changed given a lot of the cost of living discussions, but those are the top 3 globally. We do see some differences around the world, certainly supply chain in Central Europe and supply chain in Latin America was number 1. But if we hone in on the workforce agenda, because that's what we very much want to speak to today, we do see some really positive signs coming out of the data this year. First up, even though we spent the last 2 years, 6 months apart, paradoxically, we've actually got a lot closer. And metrics that relate to trust, camaraderie, working together at an all-time high. I just put one on here. Trust by employees that the company will do the right thing is increased since 2020. You can see by quite a significant amount. But equally, we've seen trust that the employer will do the right thing by their employee. Trust that they will reskill them if AI or automation changes their jobs. We've never seen that so high. Paradoxically, we've also seen that thriving, whether I'm thriving in my health, wealth, and career, also is higher than we've seen in previous years. We've been through a lot, and I think we're glad to be seeing the glimmers are coming out the other side. You're all as deep as my team is on data science. You know that averages can mask a lot of differences in society. And it's the differences that I think are really telling this year. If you have a look at where in the world people feel they're thriving or not thriving, they very much do mirror how much control and freedom was a perception of employees. We see that differences by gender, generation, and certainly by industries. And given some of the conversations that you have on your agenda at this conference, you won't be surprised to see healthcare, financial healthcare, retail, and auto, some of those more heavy industries, frontline workers faring a little lower. In fact, if I also look at our engagement data that we do around the world, you really do see a bifurcation. The knowledge workers feel burnt out, and the frontline workers feel fed up. The language in this study around the perceived inequities between people working on the front line and within organisation is very real. The inequities between people who were able to flex to digital ways of working and those that weren't, and inequities stemming from the spending spree many organisations did around pay to retain talent because of the Great Resignation at the end of the year are also rearing their head. No surprise, workforce challenges are top of everybody's mind. They do vary around the world. I just had the opportunity to spend a couple of weeks in Australia, and the biggest issue there is how do we retain our talent when we onboard them digitally? And that reflects a number of markets, including the UK, where the loss of talent when we have hired people in the last 2 years is higher than those we hired pre the pandemic. Hypothesis, it's because we have onboarded them digitally, could be due to a number of different challenges. But you can see some of the big issues here: digital exhaustion, absenteeism due to illness or unrest, and loss of talent, people who left the workforce during this period not coming back. In the UK, we see significantly more HR concerned about the loss of women and them not returning to the workplace. I do think, given all the discussion that was had last week at Davos with regard to the recession, it was useful just to put the data up that we have on the right-hand side, because at the end of last year, when we conducted this survey, we did ask the executives, if you face another recession, what will you do? And I want to compare this to their responses at the end of 2019, because we really do see some differences. Obviously, the first thing you're going to do is freeze expenses. But post that, what is now top of the list is increasing strategic partnerships. I think many organizations recognize that their resilience through this period comes from being able to share talent, being able to share supply chains. And I think we're going to see a lot more partnership working with competitors going forward. If you take your eyes to the bottom of the list, what will they not pull back on? They won't pull back on risk protection and well-being, learning and development. Mercer is one of the largest HR organisations in the world, and we know these are normally the first places that we cut spend. Discretionary spend for learning and development, how can we optimise our benefits? They're right at the bottom of the list. And I think that says something about how executives have realised that not only is their talent more fungible and could be redeployed, but getting that talent back and talent that knows your culture is one of the biggest risks if you downsize or divest too much during this period. We are here to talk about the future of work. And if you look at the green bars, these are the things that they would actually increase investment on. Not only strategic partnerships, but AI and automation, reskilling, the use of variable staffing models. I mean, that is the future of work. And so we don't know what the economic outlook will be over the next 6 months. But either way, the future of work is here, and I think it really will continue to accelerate even if we come out of this period. Across this research, there are 5 big trends that we're speaking to companies about this year that we think are really important to make progress on. We determine these 5 trends by looking at those companies that are outpacing their competitors and that are anticipating double-digit growth this year. We also look within that group to say how many of them have more of their population that feel a sense of thriving versus those that are not thriving. And these are the 5 trends. 1, we're seeing those relatable organisations reset for relevance. They're recognising that they do need to come off mute on what they care and value about, and they need to build enough adaptive capacity in their work models so that they can deliver on that new north. They're figuring out how to work in partnership. They know that it's important to create equitable, transparent, and rewarding partnerships outside the organisation, but also inside, with all these new work models we're seeing, whether it's remote, hybrid, gig working. Doing that and not derailing some of your D&I gains is a real challenge. Relatable organisations are not just prioritising total well-being, they're using data to make sure that they deliver positive health outcomes, and they're thinking about it through 4 lenses: physical health, mental health, social health, financial health. Relatable organisations are between 2 and 5 times more likely to be making progress in this area. They also recognise their vital role in building for employability, both in terms of attracting the right talent, but also making sure that they maintain their marketability and that they can return to work. We're seeing these organisations make the biggest strides I've ever seen in designing skills-based organisations and intentionally building pathways to prosperity for returning mothers, people who are furloughed, or others that need to move out of a job category into another function. Finally, I mentioned energy. I'd be remiss in saying that out of the 16 countries, I've never seen energy levels so low as self-reported by individuals. And of those 16 countries, the UK is the lowest. With 98% of organisations driving quite an aggressive transformation journey this year, we need to do that with more awareness of the employee experience. And we have some findings when we look at high energy versus low energy individuals about where that energy gets depleted and what actually gives back energy. Some of the headlines in terms of working for an organisation that's strong on purpose, and unravelling some of the complexity that we are building back at the current time are topping the list. If you're interested to learn more on these 5 trends, I will share a copy with the report post. But today, based on my pre-conversations with Paola, there's just a couple of slides that I thought would be really interesting to show you. I am going to go at a little bit of a clip, but hopefully we can unpack some of them when we have the questions. Let's look at some of the data in the area of reset for relevance. I don't need to talk about the importance of this. I think we have all witnessed how coming off mute on where you stand with Ukraine has had Switzerland coming off mute and being neutral. You've certainly got a lot of things in the press at the moment as to whether organisations want to get into the debate with Roe versus Wade. You've seen some backlashes to some large corporations who haven't stood with their people over gay rights and other topics. It's interesting how those expectations about what an organisation is vocal on and how much we respect an organisation is now playing into attraction and retention. Every year, we ask those 8,000 employees, what is the reason why you would join an organisation? And the list doesn't change that much year over year. Number 1 is always job security. But we had a jump this year from position 9 to position 2, and that was the brand and reputation of the company. Most organisations have actually come out with higher engagement and a lot of respect for their employees, and those that haven't have paid the price. Sustainability agenda is absolutely growing in the eyes of employees. 96% expect their company to be pursuing a sustainability agenda. When we asked what questions they were asking at interview, more questions around DEI than ever before was certainly evident in the Gen Y and the Gen Z populations. And no surprises, this is influencing, in part, organisations' desire to not just move forward, but be more public about what they're doing on the ESG and D&I agendas. Making progress is tough, although 88% of executives will say balancing risk and rewards across all stakeholders is a priority for us. Making progress on it is pretty tough. Just 25% said they made progress over the last 2 years. And I've just put on the side here the 5 biggest barriers they're grappling with. 1, we need to make sure that our sustainability goals are embedded in our transformation plans. At the moment, they're often sitting in separate functions, and so it's a separate initiative. The ability to uphold some of our commitments around particularly environmental best practice and sustainability when people work from home. Instant level of people investment to really deliver on our ambition. Lack of progress on diversity goals, I'll speak on that in a moment, and the inability to genuinely offer ESG-friendly fund options for investments. If you've been watching the press over the last 2 days, you will see significant CEOs stepping down when they haven't been able to deliver on that. This is new territory, but I do think that those organisations that want to reset for relevance in the eyes of all of their stakeholders are wanting to make progress on this year. The good news is a number of progressive organisations have already started the journey. And you can just look at a number of websites from leading companies to see that. Some that come to mind for me is Unilever, saying that by 2030 we will deliver flexible working for all. It's 2030 because it takes a lot of design to make sure that every job can flex. You've got leading companies such as Stanley Black & Decker saying we want to increase the diversity of our supply chain from 3% to 7% by 2025. Or companies like Zurich saying we will no longer engage in employment opportunities that aren't sustainable for the economies we're operating in. And are making sure that it's not just the cost of that labour that is driving some of their decisions. This debate has never been so lively, and we haven't seen those big commitments. Last week in Davos, at the World Economic Forum event, They released the Good Work Framework. This is a piece of work that we've been working with 60 CHROs over the last 2 years to say, if the future of work has been reset, and if it's been reset around more stakeholder capitalism values and health and well-being, along with AI and skills are part of the equation, what are some of the standards we should govern by? This is the first step to put some universal standards in place. There's going to be more coming out around metrics. But the intention is that organisations will want to sign up for this as part of the S in their ESG commitments. More to come on that, but I wanted to share we absolutely are looking for research partners to help do some of the work on there. If your eye just scans some of the figures at the bottom, you will see that we absolutely are at the beginning of that journey. And in some countries, we are very low on topics such as fair pay or equity between contingent workers and full-time workers. Lots to be done, but exciting to see these changes. I did want to just say a few words around diversity and inclusion because I did see some really positive indicators this year. The last couple of years, we have seen interest in pay equity and gender equity go up, in part because it's been public, it's been legislated, people have been asked to disclose it on their websites or in their year-end reporting. But interest in the underlying causes of inequity has stubbornly stayed in the single digits. But we have now seen that change, and quite dramatically. Interest in why people aren't progressing, not just by gender, but also by ethnicity, has made a huge jump. I'm sure Black Lives Matter, both in the US and the UK, had a big impact on that. And what I've listed here are just some of the things from our research we know really make a difference. Mercer does one of the most comprehensive studies on what really moves the needle on D&I. We collect what we call internal label map data, which is looking at which genders join your organization at each level, which genders exits, and who gets promoted. Simple, but powerful and factual. We are about to do that study again in January, February. Again, please lean in if anyone is interested in that data. But that gives us good indicators about when we compare the practices around D&I and the outcomes where we have seen a real difference. What you can see here is the top areas that people are pressing the button on: training for employees, of course, monitoring equity, creating pathways for multi-generations. But at the bottom, you can see cascading those D&I goals is not happening consistently and not considering it within M&A opportunities. Now, given that M&A is on the rise at the moment, the imperative for organizations to look at what gender inheritance or liability they might be taking on is ever more critical, in the same way at looking at what skills they might bring into the organization. And as we start to see more divestitures, focusing on that will be critical. We know year on year that when we do focus on diversity and inclusion, has a very positive impact, not just on intentions to stay, but also in terms of people's sense of thriving within the organization. You can see some of the stats on the right. The big question, of course, though, is what really makes the difference. And we found from our prior research that when organizations are doing 5 or more of these, we see a step change in the impact on the organization. Only 1 of 3 are doing that. So we need more organizations to be adopting more of these best practices. Secondly, and you've probably heard the topic male allies before, I often look at what male executives say are on their priority list and what female executives say are on their priority list and where they're putting their dollars for the year. And we do see a big difference here. Men are more likely to say we haven't made as much progress as they would like on the D&I agenda, and equally likely to say, and we're doing less, in terms that they are least likely to say we need to have a separate function or a chief diversity and inclusion officer. So bringing men along on the journey and being part of the change is critical. I'd love to turn to work in partnership, because I think work in partnership also highlights, as we figure out how to partner with people in these new work models, some of those inequities I mentioned at the beginning are certainly popping up. Oh, actually, before I go to this slide, I will say that I mentioned earlier that strategic partnerships is one area that people believe build resilience. But when I look at the internal data, it's very clear that employees' views about wanting to work for an organization have diminished. They don't want to work for an organisation. They want the organisation to work with them. And I think that really challenges the psychological contract between the employee and the employer. This is a slide which I will not go through in detail, but I wanted to leave you because of your areas of interest. We ask every year what helps employees thrive, and this year we've seen real stark differences between countries. And I think you would expect that, given that we have all become a lot more localized and have focused on national agendas during this pandemic period. At the top is absolutely feeling valued for value for your contribution, feeling you're doing fulfilling work and that you're doing real work. But we do see some differences around the regions. I certainly was surprised to see that Germany, Hong Kong, Japan, really high on fun at work. I just spent the last 7 years working in Hong Kong, and I was very pleased to see that. I can tell you that in previous years, Hong Kong has been a lot more depressed. But I think this is really interesting how we think about the future of work, because the majority of people have spent a lot of time reflecting on what they want out of that work equation, and they have been locked in their own echo chamber. And what we're seeing as a result of that are very different thoughts about what really engages and helps them thrive at work. I won't go through all of these today. You can have this data and have a look at it post. But it is quite interesting that things such as having your manager, having your back, working with the best and brightest, things that are based on collaboration with people have certainly dropped down the list. The hypothesis is, will that continue as we continue to have more hybrid working, or will that change as more of us get back into the office? But fundamentally, doing work that we enjoy, feeling recognised is top of the list. So what actually has changed? Well, a couple of things have changed. One is an acceleration of trends that we saw prior to the pandemic. People who are satisfied or engaged are just as likely to want to be leaving that organisation. That desire for more experience, more of the lifestyle contract has never been more present. And you can see where there's the highest intent to leave, automotive and tech, I think for very different reasons. HR is seeing the most turnover in young talent and people who joined during the pandemic, and they're anticipating that professionals and digital will be the big risk this year. We also asked what helps you stay after job security, no surprise, flexible working, and the things that have gone up are all about lifestyle. We also asked people, what would you forego a pay rise for this year? And you can see that 4 of the top 5 are all related to workations, lifestyle, having more control about when and how I work. We really believe that we've moved out of the loyalty contract and engagement contract that has dominated the last 20 years of work, and are now in what we call the Thrive contract, where people are gravitating towards those organisations that really look past the screen and take into account whole people considerations. We've seen, when we look at why people feel they're at burnout, particularly men, perceptions of equity or inequity are very clear. What connects people to organisations is purpose and impact. But we believe, particularly when we look at the Gen Z and Gen Y data, that it's this lifestyle contract that is the one that we now need to be looking at and understanding a little bit better. Delivering on it's pretty tough, because if you look at the return to work preferences and practices, you will see big differences between men and women, big differences across the generations, and huge chasms between where executives think work gets done and how, and young employees' views. We have a lot of that in the report. I'll just give you some headlines. 80% of executives say we have a apprenticeship model in our organisation. People learn by coming in an office and working together. Employees have said, if I can't work hybridly or remote, I'm going to be leaving, and I think we're more productive when we have new work models. If these return to work preferences become future of work practices, I think we need to make sure that the presenteeism bias that leads to pay and promotion differences don't get exacerbated. We've also seen what really does make a difference in bedding down flexible working. You can see that on the top in terms of how HR is scaling flexibility. Year 1, it was very much around training managers and tech. Year 2, it's more about culture and health. But when we look at those high growth organisations, they're doing it completely differently. They're starting with the notion that remote working, hybrid working is the norm and working back. They're more likely to be embracing 4-day work weeks. They're more likely to be really rethinking their facilities for more collaboration. And they're working harder to institute a culture without walls, so their digital onboarding and their digital tools that they're looking at. A few points I wanted to make on build for employability. Build for employability often looks like the race to reskill. The good news is 91% of people actually learned a new skill in the last couple of years. The bad news is 98% of organizations still have massive skills gaps. And that's because we haven't figured out how to earn, learn, and laugh together. So the barriers in HR's minds are very much around, if we train them, they will leave. If we start to put in a skills-based program, it'll be obsolete before we get the opportunity to reap the benefits. And for employees, I don't want to be doing that in the work environment. And quite frankly, when I have reskilled, it hasn't led to pay and promotion opportunities. So even though investment in tech for learning is at an all-time high, it hasn't delivered. And I think that really means we need to think about it more as a business challenge than a learning or HR challenge. And we really need to look at where we are bringing non-traditional talent into the workplace and being more intentional around those pathways. If you ask me what's the biggest accelerator all over the data is the use of AI and automation. High-growth companies are 3 times as likely to be investing in AI intelligence platforms or talent marketplaces like Gloat, Hitch, Eightfold, and they're making a huge difference in terms of employees' perceptions of their skills and employers' understanding of what that skills gap is. When we look at building careers, it's very clear that those progressive organizations are moving away from traditional career frameworks to looking at the talent marketplace. And you can see huge progress over the last 2 years in focusing in this area. It's now becoming part of the stated total reward proposition, and a lot of the work that we're doing around the EVP focuses on it. But there are populations such as Gen Z and baby boomers that feel left behind in some of the new thinking. And if you think about the fact that men are more willing to be mobile to take up some of those opportunities, and women feel that the skills that they have today absolutely wouldn't make them suitable for a job they've never considered or seen before, if the future really is about work without jobs, we're going to have some real challenges in making sure that we don't, again, exacerbate some of the gaps we see between the genders. Last thing I wanted to close on was the energy crisis. No, not the oil crisis, the energy crisis of employees. The good news is people are embracing AI like never before and see it could be their benefit. The reality is, to many, it's adding an additional loading. I was talking to an automotive company last week, and they said in the last year we've added 22 new tech platforms. The feedback we're getting is that leadership is a burden, not a privilege. And so we really need to rethink who these tech platforms are serving. As you saw at the beginning, employees think the future of work will be more balanced. We've thrown a lot at them this year, and we need to figure out how we get it right. Our research does show that those organizations that are looking at the human adoption of tech, that are figuring out how to make sure that they don't bring back some of those inequities across the genders, digital workers, frontline workers, and are creating a culture that's more inclusive, are doing better. Coming out of this research, there's lots of questions that we haven't as yet answered, and if anybody in the audience or online is interested in partnering us, we would love to learn a bit more on some of these points that we have here. We would love to know if making progress on good work standards and people sustainability does impact ESG ratings, does make you more attractive. We would want to know if moving from career frameworks to talent marketplaces really does excite all fractions of the population. We want to know if having more agile teams that flow talent to different work impacts their sense of belonging and commitment. And we are curious, as most people are, as whether the 4-day work week is the future of work. Hopefully I've got you interested in our data and our findings, and I would love to hand back to Paola.
Thanks. Okay, this on? Okay. One thing that I noticed, and I hope I'm getting this right, is that you found that a very high percentage of workers, 80-some%, had confidence or trust that their corporation was going to do the right thing for society. And you also found that I think 96% of employees or workers think that their corporation or expect that their corporation will have a sustainability plan that they're executing. Yet the executives said that they thought a relatively low percentage, say 25%, I think it was.
Made progress on their plan.
Made progress.
Yes.
So I wanted to make sure that I had that right, because to me that's one of the standout findings from the perspective of people like me, corporate scholars that are interested in corporate purpose and ESG and things like that. So I wonder, what do you make of that, and how do you reconcile that? Or
Well, I think
it's surprising to me that so many people have confidence that their corporation will do the right thing for society.
So I think there's two things here. One is trust and that sense of thriving. We've never seen those numbers so high, and it's a really large data set. I do think when you reflect on how am I thriving today compared to the last 2 years, that influences perceptions. So I definitely think that's part of it. But I also believe that when I look at the data, employees, executives, and HR have worked a lot closer together. So they are much more connected to what the organization is doing because they've rated them more favorably in quite a few areas. There's much more active dialogue, again, coming off me being that relatable organization, much more dialogue about what we're doing, how we are focusing. Safety and security is your concern and my concern. We're all in this pandemic together. The level of dialogue, the use of digital focus groups has skyrocketed over this period. And I think more dialogue has led to more trust. I think with more trust, though, comes high expectations. So I am expecting to see a big crash if we don't deliver on some of those expectations. And I think we need to look under the headlines, as when people say, I expect my company to make progress on the sustainability agenda, we then had a whole series going, what did you mean by that? And I can definitely share that with you when we send this pack out as well, because there were some interesting things in there, such as I expect there to be sustainability options for my retirement plan. I expect there to be roles for ESG. I expect to have a proportion of my time apportioned to... I was quite surprised, and that really does vary by country. And I think that depends on sort of what's in the popular media about where the focus is within ESG. And although I think for the E, we are beginning to get some universal standards and understanding of what that might look like in different industries, the S, we're only just starting out on. So I'll give you the data below that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts back.
Thank you very much for the presentation, a lot of food for thought. I was wondering if you had any insights on the relationship between this new flexibility of work, working from home and being much more flexible between the office and other locations, and compensation and careers. I've looked into this data from other sources, and my sense is that if this flexibility might preclude you to become a manager, then you're going to really suffer in terms of your career path and your compensation. I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yes, so obviously Mercer has the largest compensation database in the world, so we also are seeing that, and we have been very busy over the last 2 years working on how do you compensate people who are remaining at headquarters versus those that want to work from a different location. And so we do have very accurate data on how people have looked at that. And it certainly varies depending on where you are in the world. Sometimes it is bifurcating that between head office roles that actually will be tied to that location compensation bandings, and others will be, actually this is a remote role that can be anywhere in the world. We've also seen an increase in transatlantic pay benchmarks, or more of an emphasis on pay for skills. And I think that has been a bit of an accelerator for the pay for skills agenda. We will pay for hot skills related to certain roles wherever they are in the world. But if I look at the perception data, you called out some things that I didn't mention that is in there that I think are quite concerning. Executives have said that they believe there will be a very big incentive for leaders to move people who elect to be fully remote onto gig arrangements. The second thing that we also heard is both executives and HR say we do worry that people won't have the visibility if they opt for remote and hybrid working. That's essential for getting promoted. And as I flagged, presenteeism does make a big difference. And if we look at the demographics and the gender differences, we will potentially have organisations full of older white men, which again is something we want to mitigate. But I'm happy to go a little deeper on the rewards question offline. I'm around this evening.
I'm actually wondering if you have, over time, measured the differences of opinion between managerial roles and the rest of the employees, and whether that has changed. Because, and let me elaborate a little bit. So it seems a bit over-optimistic what comes from the employees here. So one concern I have is that you have a highly, who's going to participate to these surveys? Maybe Mercer is fishing from the best, and the, Apple and the Google of the world, just a certain, best place to work. And so the question is, because, it really conflict with the big resignation phenomenon that, people don't seem to be that happy, or at least are reevaluating their way of, thinking about work. So I'm wondering
We
if you
do.
have
So a couple of things. One, we use an outside agency because, as opposed to Mercer data, so that we make sure that it is across those 16 countries and 13 industries, and we get a good mix of frontline workers and managerial roles. Because you're right, we might only work with a few, certain sector of society. And we do analysis between individual contributors, middle managers, and senior executives. And we do see some quite stark differences. One of the ones that absolutely sits in my mind at the moment is regard to how AI and automation would impact my role and my sense of role security. The further you are up in the organisation, the more connected people feel they are to that future of work digitisation plan, and feel more assured that they will be able to pivot when the roles change. People lower down the organisation feel a real disconnect, and that is biggest for people who don't feel that they're thriving. Certainly in the deck that I picked out today, I picked the highest stats and the number one and the number two. We have some very dismal numbers in some other areas where we think there is some real call-outs where we need to focus more attention. I think health and well-being, particularly in countries where we don't have enough welfare protection, is some very significant call-outs. I think the D&I numbers are still low. They're better than they've been in previous years, but absolutely nowhere near what we would need to close the gender gap. And I do think the headlines around burnout, yes, it's a very high number, but it's a worryingly high number. I don't think we're doing enough to mitigate some of that. Any other questions?
I'm just thinking that
We're
stay on track.
almost out of time.
We're almost out of time.
Yeah, we're actually 2 minutes.
Oh, really? Oh, I guess I have a different. Are we,
Okay.
I think we're out of time. No?
We're actually
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Okay.
We're out of time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
It's been great to chat today.